In the long reign of a single queen, Britain changed the world and was itself utterly transformed. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. By the time she died in 1901, we had made the modern world.
It was a time of brilliant engineering, pioneering innovation, all of it driven by fearless men and women who dreamt big and shaped the country we live in today.
Fast and effective new transport systems shrank the world.
You travel further, faster. The railways compress space and time.
Startling innovations above and below ground saved lives.
We'd grab the saw like this.
It's more like carpentry than surgery.
Groundbreaking ideas nurtured our minds and souls.
It was feeling like you were dancing in one of the great European palaces.
And a revolution in law and order set us on course for the freedoms we take for granted today.
You're brought from the darkness of the prisons into this glory.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
It is.
This is the story of how the Victorians built Britain. When Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, the railway was still in its infancy.
There was an appetite for everywhere to be connected.
Soon, thousands of miles of track crisscrossed the nation, and futuristic trains carried people and goods at then unimaginable speeds.
It's just that era of pushing the boundaries of what is humanly possible. It's wonderful.
And then, Victorian vision and ingenuity and determination took a good idea and used it to change Britain. At the start of Queen Victoria's reign, there were only a handful of short railway lines, but that year marked the start of what amounted to railway mania, an explosion of railway construction up and down the country. And for the trains themselves, it was all about one source of power: steam. In 1829, a little yellow steam locomotive called the Rocket burst onto the scene. It brought together a number of design innovations and was the most advanced engine of its day. Improvements in the boiler, pistons and wheel arrangement made the Rocket lighter and faster than any that had gone before. The Rocket was so successful, it became the blueprint for all future steam trains. It was designed by the legendary Northern engineers George and Robert Stephenson and ran on the Liverpool to Manchester Railway built by George. This father and son duo were the pioneers of railway design in Britain. Tanfield Railway in County Durham is one of the oldest working railways in the world and home to a beautiful original Victorian locomotive with links to the Rocket. Don't like to tell you this, Ian, but she's leaking.
Oh, dear. It's just while it's warming up, it'll be fine.
How old is she?
I'm not very good at maths this morning, but 1891 built.
1891?
1891,
Well,
yeah.
nearly 130 years old.
It's getting around, yeah.
And who designed her?
Robert Stephenson.
The Robert Stephenson?
The Robert Stephenson. Incredible engineer of the time.
Every single nut and bolt on this engine was crafted and fitted by hand. Unlike Stephenson's little 4-ton Rocket, which was designed for speed, this descendant was all about power and weighs in at 41 tons.
What was she built for?
Hauling coal from the local coalfields down to the main line at Birtley.
And they called her Twizzle or Twizel?
Twizel. Twizzle is somebody off the magic roundabout. Yeah.
And why Twizel?
Twizel's a local colliery.
So it was built just to pull coal. And how long did she do that for?
Ended up going to preservation in 1970.
1970?
Yeah. And it's still working now, as you'll find out. Watch your step here, mate.
Yeah, OK. This is your office, is it, Ian?
Yes.
Oh, I love that.
Ian's taking me for a ride on this lovely old iron workhorse.
When you're looking at it, it's chunky, really big bits of metal and brass. What do you think of it?
It's tremendous engineering. So basic, it's such a simple engine, and yet it's so powerful.
So what sort of speed would she do when she's kind of, you know, going properly?
45 miles an hour.
Really?
Oh, yes.
The early railway lines, like this one at Tanfield, were local, just from A to B. There was no sense of a unified national network. But it all took off amazingly quickly. Everybody wanted to invest in the railways, and soon private lines were opening up all over the country.
I've travelled one stop down the Tanfield Railway to find out how this small colliery line became part of the modern railway network.
Actually, they call it the world's oldest railway. What were its origins?
This begins in 1725 as the Causey Wagonway. Wooden rails and wooden sleepers and horses. It wouldn't be a sleepy, bucolic byway, it would be an artery of industry.
How soon before it was converted to steel rails for a proper steam railway?
Well, the railway's converted in the 1830s. It becomes part of a network and part of the mania that's sweeping Britain throughout the 19th century.
Is there any single figure that stands out in this great expansion of the railway?
If you're talking about railways, we have to talk about George Hudson of York, the railway king, as he became styled through the 1840s. And Hudson really came from nowhere. He's got no great background as such, but 1827 he is left £30,000 by his great uncle. Now, £30,000 in 1827 is about £3.5 million in today's money, and he buys his way into the establishment, as it were.
And amongst the things he bought was this railway.
Yeah.
After successfully investing in the railway linking London to York, Hudson decided to push further north and build a line from London to Gateshead. To do this, he bought up this stretch of railway, transforming it into a major rail link. But the ambitious Hudson had only just got started and poured even more money into the creation of new lines across the north.
How ruthless was he, and how quickly did he come to control a big section of the railways?
By 1846, Hudson has control of over 1,000 miles of railway track.
And what did that represent in terms of the totality?
It's about a quarter of the network.
He owned or controlled a quarter of the network?
Absolutely.
In the year 1846 alone, 272 applications were put forward for new railway lines in Britain. As rail shares rocketed, vast fortunes were made and celebrities created. Hudson had gone from being a nobody to having audiences with the Queen. But behind his meteoric rise was a darker story.
He had his own money, but even so, how could he have afforded this?
It's where a little bit of sharp practice came in, and this was the beginning of Hudson's downfall, really. He was found that he was falsifying accounts, he was selling land that wasn't his to sell.
So, was Hudson a crook?
Yes.
So what happened to him?
He spends a bit of time in debtor's prison, but friends rally round and bail him out. But you know, he dies a broken man in 1871 and his reputation in tatters.
What does the rise and fall of George Hudson and the whole railway mania that you've described, what does that tell us about the Victorians?
What the railway mania tells us is there was an appetite for everywhere to be connected. It's unifying the country in a way that nothing else can do. And the incredible thing is that the railway age really starts in the northeast here.
Something that had started as a means to move freight in the industrial northeast had now spread across the nation as the Victorian demand for high-speed travel boomed.
It all happened in the most enormous rush. At the start of 1837, there were just 400 miles of railways. By 1840, just 3 years later, that had tripled, almost quadrupled, 1,500 miles of railways, connecting up cities like London, Birmingham, Liverpool.
But as railway lines began to link up, a problem soon emerged which caused a railway war that pitted north against south and drove the two biggest railway engineers of the age to go head to head. In 1830, George Stephenson opened his first intercity railway, linking the two major hubs of Britain's textile industry, Liverpool and Manchester. Business boomed, and in one record shipment, 100 rail trucks transported 500 tons of cotton between the two cities. And as job opportunities increased, the railway provided transport for over 1,000 passengers a day. When new lines were opened a few years later, linking Liverpool directly to London, the Port of Liverpool became the West Coast gateway for trade between Britain and America. It was a coup for Liverpool, but it was a disaster for their biggest rivals at the time, Bristol. The two cities were in head-to-head competition for the lucrative American trade routes. The new railway line put Liverpool way ahead of the curve. The Bristolians demanded their own railway line through to London, Victoria's great capital city, to keep Bristol and its port afloat. So in 1838, the Great Western Railway opened and began building lines towards the capital. The railway was constructed by none other than Isambard Kingdom Brunel. One of the greatest civil engineers in British history, Brunel was famed for his cutting-edge ship design, revolutionary tunnelling techniques, and awe-inspiring bridges.
How did he set about it? Did he just see what Stephenson and the others were doing up in the north and copy them?
He went up north and travelled on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, but he decided his railway would be his own creation and it wouldn't be a carbon copy of railways like the Liverpool and Manchester. So he decided he would build a complete railway system of his own.
In what way was it different?
The main one, of course, is the track gauge. It would be built to 7 feet and 1/4 inch.
The gauge, or width, of the tracks can be seen here at the Didcot Railway Centre on the Great Western Railway. At 7 feet and 1/4 inch, Brunel's gauge was over 2 feet wider than the standard gauge.
What did he see as the advantage of having a wider gauge to the tracks?
There would be smoother running. The carriages were larger, that you could carry more passengers. He saw it as a really groundbreaking railway that would take railway development forward.
And did it turn out that way? Was the Great Western Railway quicker, more comfortable than the others?
Initially, yes, it was, and it had a reputation for being a rather stately way of travelling. But, of course, they had the very knotty problem of what were called breaks of gauge, where the two types of railways met.
One station where the two types of gauges clashed was Gloucester. Here, even the Queen was forced to get off one gauge train onto another to continue her journey.
So you had Brunel's Great Western Railway running on these wide tracks. You had all the rest in the north on narrower tracks. How was this resolved?
What became known as the Gauge War in the mid-1840s was only really addressed by a Royal Commission in 1845. They took evidence from all the engineers of the time, including Brunel and Stephenson, to get an idea of what should be the track gauge for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Did the Commission come to any conclusions about which was better?
Ultimately, the Commission had to look at it from a practical point of view. By the time the Gauge Commission reported, there were about 1,900 miles of what we call standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5, and only 274 miles of broad gauge at that point.
So Brunel's idea, and Brunel himself, I suppose, lost out.
It did, but of course Brunel was unrepentant when he was asked, if you were going to build it now, what would you do? And he said, I might be being accused of being reckless, but I'd build it even wider.
Standard gauge was rolled out across the country. Because of his reputation, Brunel was allowed to keep broad gauge on his Great Western Railway. But a third rail was included to allow narrow gauge trains also to travel on it. And on his broad gauge, Brunel went on to build a class of locomotive that would become the fastest engine in the world.
Tim, why was it called the Iron Duke?
Well, it was named after the Iron Duke himself, who was the Duke of Wellington. So it was a throwback to the politics of the time, of course.
But he was Prime Minister, so they were butting him up a bit.
Quite probably. The railway companies are no different then as they are now, I guess.
So why is the Iron Duke locomotive special?
Well, it had a big, powerful boiler that generated a lot of steam to enable the engine to go fast, but it also had a new wheel arrangement. So it had 4 wheels in the front, then a great big 8-foot driving wheel, and then another set of wheels behind that, and that gave the engine a bit of stability. The year after the engine was built, they did some tests on the line. The driver's name was Mad Sandy, which is an interesting thing, but they managed to touch almost 77 miles an hour at one point. So for people growing up in the age of the horse, travelling at those kinds of speeds must have been a tremendous innovation and quite scary.
Despite losing the gauge war, Brunel's Great Western Railway was an extraordinary engineering achievement which transformed the southwest of England. One of the most spectacular structures on the line is the Warncliffe Viaduct. This majestic structure was one of Brunel's first masterpieces. Constructed entirely of brick, it spans over 270 metres in length and nearly 20 metres in height. But this feat of engineering didn't just carry trains. In 1837, the electrical telegraph was invented, and Brunel quickly saw the possibilities of using it to run the railways. Messages could be tapped out and sent down cables following the route of the railway lines. Information that would have taken hours, even days to deliver, would now be received almost instantly. And it was here, along the Warncliffe Viaduct, that the world's first ever commercial telegraph system was installed in 1839. And just a few years later, John Tawell became the first murderer to be caught by telegraph when a message was sent along this very line notifying authorities that he'd boarded the 742 from Slough wearing a brown greatcoat. The telegraph network spread quickly, linking up people and businesses across Britain and even other nations. Before long, most of the world was connected. It was the Victorian internet. Between them, the telegraph system and the Great Western Railway changed the very nature of time. Before then, there was no such thing as standard time across Britain. Each town set their own, mainly on the basis of where the sun was, which meant that everywhere west of London was behind Greenwich Mean Time. So if it was midday in London, it would be 11:56 in Oxford, 11:50 in Bristol, and 11:40 in North Wales. But when the railways came along, all that changed. Once trains could cross the entire country in a day, they had to draw up timetables. And this was impossible if the clocks in every town told a different time. So in 1840, the Great Western Company announced that all its stations would operate on a standard time, what they called railway time. In some cities, like Bristol, the clocks had 2 sets of hands, one telling local time and the other railway time dictated by Greenwich. Eventually, in 1880, the government declared a single standard time zone. It wasn't just the telegraph that revolutionized communication. Trains themselves brought about a radical change in the way people kept in touch with each other. I've come to the National Railway Museum in York to find out more about how the railways revolutionized our postal service. When did they first start carrying the post on the railways?
Mail is carried on the railways from the beginning of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830. Within days of the railway opening, the post office is having to negotiate terms with the railway to carry the mail because the mail coaches just can't keep up.
So right at the start?
Absolutely. The whole thing with carrying mail by rail is it gives you speed. It gives you the ability to distribute across the country. You can post something at 7 o'clock in the evening and by breakfast time it's with the person that you want in Glasgow.
To ensure the speediest of deliveries, the fastest trains on each line were selected.
and travel was barred to ordinary passengers, except those willing to pay a premium.
How did these trains actually pick up the post?
You need to do it on the move, and this net is hung out the side of the carriage. It folds down and it catches bags of mail that were hung up by the side of the track. It scoops up the bags as the train goes past, and the speed of the train throws them through the open door at the side of the carriage, where the staff, the sorting teams, then open the bags and begin to sort the mail.
It's ingenious.
It's cracking.
And it worked.
Absolutely. And this system worked from the 1830s until 1971.
Good gracious.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
Before the railway, Britain's postal system was expensive and complicated, with charges based on letter size and distance. But the new high-speed rail mail helped usher in the world's first postage stamp, the penny black. Now letters could be sent around the country at a flat rate. So the railways helped create the postal service we still rely on today. And even modern sorting offices aren't that different from the interior of this train.
And this is an authentic Victorian postal sorting carriage.
Yeah, this is...
As it was.
This is the oldest travelling post office in the world that's still in existence today. It dates from 1885, but the practice of travelling post offices only finishes in 2004.
Good Lord, yeah.
So it's like this for over a century.
How many people would be working here?
You'd have a couple of dozen working in here, and bearing in mind the train is on the move continuously, 50, 60 miles an hour, chewing the miles up, chewing the distance, and you've got to get the post on the move.
And how did it actually work?
You're moving, for a start. So people have got to sit here and try and brace themselves while they sort.
And you can't see out?
No, there's no windows because windows take up space. So you've got bags on one side, you've got the sorting racks on this side. The train is a distribution depot on the move.
What sort of effect did this process have? Not just on the railway industry, but on the country as a whole?
Well, it transforms. It's been said that, you know, you travel further, faster, and you shrink the country. The railways compress space and time. But it's also meaning that you can deliver other things as well. So as the century progresses, newspapers are transported by train, parcels are transported by train. Everything that you need to be there the following day is transported by train.
The growth of the railway network had transformed the landscape of Britain. But as the century moved on, trains became more specialised and able to carry everything from slate to the most precious cargo in the land. The railways had connected up Britain, offering new opportunities for trade and travel, and advancing new technology that kept us all in touch. Railway mania had swept the nation, and everyone was on board, from the Liverpool dock worker to the highest person in the land. When she was just 23 years old, Queen Victoria became the first British monarch to travel by rail, sparking a love affair with trains that would last a lifetime. In fact, she loved them so much, she had her own special carriages made. And this was her favourite. In 1869, Queen Victoria hired the best coach builders and craftsmen in the land to build this.
It's a miracle that this piece of railway history survived, because Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, wanted it to be burned after she died. But the railwaymen loved it so much, they hid it away. And you can understand why, and thank goodness they did. It may very well be the most lavish railway carriage ever built. Look at it, it's all amazingly padded and festooned and frogged, the high point of Victorian furnishing, but actually picked by Victoria herself, paid for by Victoria herself. And look at it. It's not just Victorian taste, it's Victoria's taste. This is the cosy royal bedroom on wheels. She liked her rest. In fact, she insisted that the train should go no more than 30 miles an hour, otherwise it'd be uncomfortable for her. By the mid-19th century, British train design was right at the cutting edge, and the same Victorian skill and ingenuity that produced a luxurious carriage for the Queen solved a very different design problem. In the hills around Blaenau-Festiniog, there's a very special railway that's had an enormous impact, not just in Britain, but across the whole world. This remote corner of Wales produces some of the best slate in the world, used on buildings in New York, Melbourne, and even the Houses of Parliament. But getting the slate out of the quarry to satisfy demand presented a new challenge for the Victorian engineer. Andrew, how did the Festiniog Railway come about?
The railway started here as a horse tramway in the 1830s. Loaded trucks roll down the hill, horses pull the empty trucks back up. Then in the 1860s, we got the first steam engines, and that meant you could take more empty trucks up and thus get more traffic. But by the late 1860s, you just couldn't get enough trucks up, so you needed to be able to have a more powerful engine.
But the quarry was so inaccessible, the trains would have to contend with narrow tunnels and very sharp bends.
If you want to make a bigger engine, the classic way to do it is to make it longer, give it more wheels. But if you do that, you end up with a long, rigid wheelbase that won't go around tight corners. So the other approach is to take a four-wheeled engine and just make it bigger, at which point it gets fatter and taller, and then it won't fit through the tunnels.
A whole new approach to engine design was required. And luckily, engineer Robert Fairley had an ingenious solution in mind. He came up with a long, thin engine that could navigate sharp bends because the framework the wheels were attached to swiveled under the body of the train.
Having the idea of why don't we make it bendy is just so off the wall that it was an astounding breakthrough by Fairley to think, what else can I do other than just making it bigger to make the locomotive do what I want it to?
The double Fairley, as it became known, had another unique quality. It was double-ended, so the driver had a clear view driving in or out of the quarry. Fairley's design proved so successful, it quickly gained attention far beyond Wales, with buyers from as far afield as India and the United States. And his innovative swivelling mechanism is still used on many trains today. What impresses you most about this lovely little engine?
I think in terms of Victorian railway engineering design, it's the fact that they just went for it. I've got a problem, I will find a solution. I will build it. And then I will tell everybody in the world about it.
It was the way Victorians approach problems in this life and the next. Waterloo Station, grandest of entrances to what is the UK's busiest and by some measures biggest railway station. But behind that magnificent facade, there's a dark Victorian secret. In 1854, a new line opened at Waterloo, but this was no ordinary commuter line. This railway was for London's dead. This is the entrance to the original Necropolis railway station. The coffins would be brought in here, taken through, loaded onto the trains, followed by all the mourners. Then they'd set out on their journey to their final resting place, 30 miles outside London. When it opened, Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey was the largest burial ground in the world and the final stop on the Necropolis Railway. So this was actually the very platform?
Yeah, so we're standing right now on the cemetery platform.
So how did this all come about?
Well, between the start of the 19th century and the
1850s, London's population was growing massively. What this does is put immense pressure on the cemetery space in and around London. And there is huge concern about the health implications. So there was a real pressing need to solve this.
The solution was the Necropolis Railway, which carried up to 2,000 bodies and countless mourners every year.
So how did it work?
They would wait in a waiting room at Necropolis's station in Waterloo. And this was a station that was divided by class, so you had first, second and third, but also you'd have them separated by denomination. Even in, shall we say, hearse vans, there was separate sections for Anglican and nonconformists and by class. So they were very...
Even the coffins were segregated into first, second, third and...
Yeah, the train would come out here where the burial would take place.
The Necropolis Railway was forced to close in 1941 after the line and the London terminal were bombed during the Second World War.
What does this still vast cemetery, with its own railway service, tell us about the ambition of Victorians?
Well, they had grand ideas. They had a vision for how things should be, and it's how Victorians thought. Let's do it big, let's do it good, let's do it powerfully.
The class system dominated all aspects of Victorian life. When train travel first became popular in the 1830s, the fares were too costly for most people. And on the few trains that did accommodate working-class passengers, they were forced to travel in open wagon-style carriages. But in 1844, an act was passed ordering all rail companies to provide at least one service a day with third-class fares. People realised they could afford to take the train to destinations around Britain just for leisure. The train companies were soon offering Monday morning tickets from the coast back to London. It was the first time that people were able to enjoy what became known as the weekend. And where better to spend your weekend than at the seaside? With the birth of the railway and fast, cheap travel, Victorian holidaymakers flocked to seaside towns such as Blackpool, Aberystwyth and Brighton. And it was here in 1883 that inventor Magnus Vogt drove the train revolution into the modern age by building Britain's first electric railway. Powered by a hidden generator, the train carried excited tourists along the Brighton seafront at a stately speed of 6 miles an hour.
I think we have to remember how new this technology was. I mean, it's always fun, isn't it, to travel on the seafront? So to travel in something so revolutionary, I mean, normally if you're travelling on rails, everyone is used to steam and sound and noise, and this is a relatively quiet experience, and where's the power coming from?
The line was an instant hit with Brighton's holidaymakers. But this little novelty train had a far bigger impact than just pleasing tourists. Vogt's technology was well ahead of its time. It was taken up in the early 1900s when Britain started electrifying its national railway, and it's still used today. His electric railway was so successful that Magnus Vogt looked to extend the line from Brighton across to neighbouring Rottingdean. But the steep cliff faces between the two towns made this dream seemingly impossible. Undeterred, the visionary Vogt decided if his line couldn't run over land, it would simply have to run through the sea.
The Pioneer was an incredible Jules Verne type contraption. It is essentially a sea-going train. On 4 stilts that went up, a beautifully ornate Victorian capsule where people sat that had carved wood, sofas, beautiful tapestry. At high tide, it was in the sea, running along the sea by electricity. It's the most bizarre thing you can imagine.
Using an overhead wire system similar to today's trams, the Pioneer propelled intrepid Victorian tourists down the coast. It was nicknamed the Daddy Longlegs. This Victorian oddity was a huge hit, and in 1 year alone, over 44,000 people travelled on it, including the Prince of Wales. Sadly, in 1901, the line was forced to close to make way for new sea defences. But although short-lived, Victorian Britain had never seen anything like it. And the Pioneer remains a symbol of the glory of Victorian ingenuity.
It's just that wonderful, optimistic era of invention and building and just pushing the boundaries of what is humanly possible. It's wonderful, I love it.
Volk may have electrified the holidaying public in Brighton, but over in Wales, another railway would take the tourism boom to new and unimagined heights. Thanks to the railways, the Victorians had connected the whole country. They triumphed over vast distances, time and even death. But there was one final, seemingly impossible challenge. In the small Welsh village of Llanberis, Victorian engineers took on the tallest mountain in England and Wales, Mount Snowdon. This little steam engine is going to propel me over 1,000 metres up to the summit. Joining me for the ride is the railway's resident expert, John Taylor.
John, how far are we going? Do we actually get to the summit?
Well, that's the plan, weather permitting, so it'll be 4 3/4 miles to the summit.
You can certainly hear and feel the engine really working.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these engines work probably harder than any other steam engines that still run in the UK.
Before you had the railway, I mean, presumably some people, a few people, used to go to the summit.
What people used to do in general was they would hire a guide, or sometimes a guide and a pony, and go up the mountain that way.
So, who came up with the idea of a railway, and how did that idea get adopted?
Well, it was quite contentious. The whole area, including the mountain, it was owned by a character called Ashton Smith. And he was quite resistant to the idea of snorting steam engines despoiling the landscape. It was largely, I believe, pressure from his tenants, which actually convinced him and won him over.
The people who lived in the small town of Llanberis at the foot of Mount Snowdon could see the potential of cashing in on the new tourism boom. After persuading the landowner, construction began in 1894 on the Snowdon Mountain Railway.
Building any railway is a big job, but building a railway that goes like that must be really hard.
Well, it was, but much of it was cut through with pick and shovel. There was some blasting necessary on the upper sections of the line, and you've got to remember that guys in this area are very experienced at quarrying, so they were used to handling explosives and cutting their way through impenetrable rock.
And how hard did they work? They work every day?
Yeah, they did, but it's not so much just the physical work. You've got to factor in also the weather conditions. Weather can change on the mountain within a matter of minutes. It can be lovely and sunny like it is now. 5 minutes' time, it can be blowing a gale and hammering it down with rain. But they had to carry on. The actual track itself was laid in just 72 days.
Good Lord.
So,
remarkably quick.
On Easter Sunday, 1896, the great and the good of the land flocked to Llanberis to witness the opening of Britain's highest ever railway.
So what happened when the railway finally was opened that Easter?
massive publicity. Unfortunately, the publicity that was generated was entirely of the wrong sort. Locomotive number 1, Ladas, pushed 2 carriages to the summit. And on the return, the locomotive ran out of control, left the track entirely, flew over the top of the footpath and plunged down the mountainside. But because the locomotive and the carriage aren't coupled together, the carriages remained on the line and were brought to a stop by the guard. The locomotive crew jumped off. They had no choice but to let it go.
They leapt?
They leapt off the locomotive and they were completely unharmed. Unfortunately, one passenger who was travelling on the train struck his leg and the fellow was brought down to Llanberis and his leg was amputated. But unfortunately, he'd lost so much blood that he died the same day.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's the only fatality that's ever occurred on the Snowdon Mountain Railway.
Because of the extremely steep incline, the train is held to the mountainside by a cog that locks into teeth on the track. It was this system that had failed, and so a new safety mechanism was devised that would prevent this from ever happening again. A year later, the line reopened, and the train ride was such a unique prospect, the crowds soon came back.
It became massively popular very quickly, and Llanberis started benefiting from having the railway there. So guest houses, hotels, cafes all started booming, and it really opened up this part of North Wales.
What does this railway represent?
I suppose it really represents a sort of a triumph of engineering over the natural landscape. I mean, to actually cut a railway line up England and Wales's highest mountain, it's quite an achievement, really, isn't it, when you consider it was done largely with pick and shovel.
The wind is something, isn't it? Yeah.
The journey to the top takes an hour, and it's as spectacular and awe-inspiring today as it must have been nearly 120 years ago.
Goodness, it's windy up here, but you can see why the Victorians braved that blustery journey. For most, travel had only just become a possibility. Now it was a passion. They probably wouldn't have seen a sight like this on anything other than a painting. On a clear day, you can see Ireland 75 miles away. On a bad day, you can't see anything at all. Up mountains, across seas, where they're moving huge numbers of people, transporting the lifeblood of industry, or taking the dead to their final resting place. It took extraordinary vision and determination to make the railways into the institution it was to become. With their railway revolution, the Victorians pushed at the boundaries of possibility, creating the engines and the infrastructure that was to change the course of British history. Next time, I uncover the surprising secrets of Victoria's warships.
The ship's actually made largely from scrap in the form of scissors or bedsteads.
Dine out in upper-class splendour.
Wow, this is kind of Downton Abbey afloat.
It is.
And discover how Britannia ruled above and below the waves.
It is a pivotal moment for the Royal Navy. We had more submarines than anybody.